Hello Year 4, welcome back. It's now week 4 and welcome to today's English lesson. Today we're going to read the next 2 chapters of George's Marvellous Medicine. But before we do, let's see what we're learning. Today's learning is about similes. Can you remember what those are? Have a think for a minute and then I'll tell you. A simile is a phrase or group of words that's used to compare 2 things. And similes use the words like or as to do their comparing. A few examples are here. You could say someone was as brave as a lion, so comparing them to a lion. You could say you slept like a log if you slept really well. You could say somebody turned as white as a ghost if they were scared. Or you could say somebody was crying like a baby. Similes can be used in all sorts of situations and with all sorts of words. For example, here we've got a blue box which has adjectives in it. We've got a purple box that has verbs in it. And we have a red box that contains nouns. I want you to think of ways that you can use these words to compare things. For example, I could use the word bouncy and say that something was as bouncy as a kangaroo, because kangaroos are really bouncy. Pause the video and have a think about some of these words. Can you think of similes that go with them? Here are the ones I came up with. It was as bouncy as a kangaroo. The fairy was as tiny as a baby's fingernail. She would fight like a tiger. He could sing like an angel. She had hair like wet straw. Or he had a voice like a bear with a sore throat. We use comparisons in our writing to help the reader picture what we're describing. Okay, I think we're ready. Let's read the next chapter of the story. This chapter at last is called Grandma Gets the Medicine. Grandma sat hunched in her chair by the window. The wicked little eyes followed George closely as he crossed the room towards her. "You're late," she snapped. "I don't think I am, Grandma." "Don't interrupt me in the middle of a sentence," she shouted. "But you'd finished your sentence, Grandma." "There you go again," she cried. "Always interrupting and arguing. You really are a tiresome little boy. What's the time?" "It's exactly 11 o'clock, Grandma." "You're lying as usual. Stop talking so much and give me my medicine. Shake the bottle first, then pour it onto the spoon and make sure it's a whole spoonful." "Are you going to gulp it down in one go?" George asked her. "Or will you sip it?" "What I do is none of your business," the old woman said. "Fill the spoon." As George removed the cork and began very slowly to pour the thick brown stuff into the spoon, he couldn't help thinking back upon all the mad and marvellous things that had gone into the making of this crazy stuff. The shaving soap, the hair remover, the dandruff cure, the automatic washing machine powder, the flea powder for dogs, the shoe polish, the black pepper, the horseradish sauce, and all the rest of them, not to mention the powerful animal pills and powders and liquids, and the brown paint. "Open your mouth wide, Grandma," he said, "and I'll pop it in." The old hag opened her small wrinkled mouth, showing disgusting pale brown teeth. "Here we go," George cried out. "Swallow it down." He pushed the spoon well into her mouth and tipped the mixture down her throat. Then he stepped back to watch the result. It was worth watching. Grandma yelled, "Owie!" and her whole body shot up, whoosh, into the air. It was exactly as though someone had pushed an electric wire through the underneath of her chair and switched on the current. Up she went like a jack-in-the-box, and she didn't come down. She stayed there, suspended in mid-air, about 2 feet up, still in a sitting position, but rigid now, frozen, quivering, the eyes bulging, the hair standing straight up on end. "Is something wrong, Grandma?" George asked her politely. "Are you all right?" Suspended up there in space, the old girl was beyond speaking. The shock that George's marvellous mixture had given her must have been tremendous. You'd have thought she'd swallowed a red-hot poker the way she took off from that chair. Then down she came again, with a plop, back into her seat. "Call the fire brigade!" she shouted suddenly. "My stomach's on fire!" "It's just the medicine, Grandma," George said. "It's good, strong stuff." "Fire!" the old woman yelled. "Fire in the basement! Get a bucket! Man the hoses! Do something quick!" "Cool it, Grandma," George said. But he got a bit of a shock when he saw the smoke coming out of her mouth and out of her nostrils. Clouds of black smoke were coming out of her nose and blowing around the room. "By golly, you really are on fire," George said. "Of course I'm on fire," she yelled. "I'll be burned to a crisp. I'll be fried to a frizzle. I'll be boiled like a beetroot." George ran into the kitchen and came back with a jug of water. "Open your mouth, Grandma," he cried. He could hardly see her for the smoke, but he managed to pour half a jugful down her throat. A sizzling sound, the kind you get if you hold a hot frying pan under a cold tap, came up from deep down in Grandma's stomach. The old hag bucked and shied and snorted. She gasped and gurgled. Spouts of water came shooting out of her, and the smoke cleared away. "The fire's out," George announced proudly. "You'll be all right now, Grandma." "All right," she yelled. "Who's all right? There's Jackie jumpers in my tummy. There's squigglers in my belly. There's bangers in my bottom." She began bouncing up and down in the chair. Quite obviously, she was not very comfortable. "You'll find it's doing you a lot of good, that medicine, Grandma," George said. "Good?" she screamed. "Doing me good? It's killing me." Then she began to bulge. She was swelling. She was puffing up all over. Someone was pumping her up, that's how it looked. Was she going to explode? Her face was turning from purple to green. But wait, she had a puncture somewhere. George could hear the hiss of escaping air. She stopped swelling. She was going down. She was slowly getting thinner again, shrinking back and back slowly to her shrivelly old self. "How's things, Grandma?" George said. No answer. Then a funny thing happened. Grandma's body gave a sudden sharp twist and a sudden sharp jerk, and she flipped herself clear out of her chair and landed neatly on her 2 feet on the carpet. "That's terrific, Grandma," George cried. "You haven't stood up like that for years. Look at you. You're standing up all on your own and you're not even using a stick." Grandma didn't even hear him. The frozen, pop-eyed look was back with her again now. She was miles away in another world. Marvellous medicine, George told himself. He found it fascinating to stand there watching what it was doing to the old hag. What next, he wondered. He soon found out. Suddenly, she began to grow. It was quite slow at first, just a very gradual inching upwards, up, 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 inch by inch, getting taller and taller, about an inch every few seconds. And in the beginning, George didn't notice it. But when she had passed the 5'6" mark and was going on upwards towards being 6 feet tall, George gave a jump and shouted, "Hey, Grandma, you're growing! You're going up! Hang on, Grandma, you'd better stop now or you'll be hitting the ceiling." But Grandma didn't stop. It was a truly fantastic sight, this ancient, scrawny old woman getting taller and taller, longer and longer, thinner and thinner, as though she were a piece of elastic being pulled upwards by invisible hands. When the top of her head actually touched the ceiling, George thought she was bound to stop. But she didn't. There was a sort of crunching noise, and bits of plaster and cement came raining down. "Hadn't you better stop now, Grandma?" George said. "Daddy's just had this whole room repainted." But there was no stopping her now. Soon her head and shoulders had completely disappeared through the ceiling, and she was still going. George dashed upstairs to his own bedroom, and there she was, coming up through the floor like a mushroom. "Whoopee!" she shouted, finding her voice at last. "Hallelujah! Here I come! Steady on, Grandma, George said. With a hey, noddy, no, and up we go, she shouted. Just watch me grow. This is my room, George said. Look at the mess you're making. Terrific medicine, she cried. Give me some more. She's dotty as a donut, George thought. Come on, boy, give me some more, she yelled. Dish it out. I'm slowing down. George was still clutching the medicine bottle in one hand and the spoon in the other. Oh well, he thought, why not? He poured out a second dose and popped it into her mouth. Owie! She screamed, and up she went again. Her feet were still on the floor downstairs in the living room, but her head was moving quickly towards the ceiling of the bedroom. I'm on my way now, boy, she called down to George. Just watch me go. That's the attic above you, Grandma, George called out. I'd keep out of there. It's full of bugs and bogles. Crash! The old girl's head went through the ceiling as though it were butter. George stood in his bedroom gazing at the shambles. There was a big hole in the floor and another in the ceiling, and sticking up like a post between the two was the middle part of Grandma. Her legs were in the room below and her head in the attic. I'm still going, came the old screechy voice from up above. Give me another dose, my boy, and let's go through the roof. No, Grandma, no, George called back. You're busting up the whole house. To heck with the house, she shouted. I want some fresh air. I haven't been outside for 20 years. By golly, she is going through the roof, George told himself. He ran downstairs. He rushed out of the back door into the yard. It would be simply awful, he thought, if she bashed up the roof as well. His father would be furious. And he, George, would get the blame. He had made the medicine. He had given her too much. Don't come through the roof, Grandma, he prayed. Please don't. Goodness me, I think George is going to be in a lot of trouble for that. And what's going to happen to Grandma? Well, we'll find out with the next chapter in just a minute. But let's have a look at this part of the chapter we've just read. Pause the video and see if you can spot the simile that Roald Dahl has used. Did you find it? Let's see. So it's this sentence, up she went like a jack-in-the-box. Now a jack-in-the-box is this picture down here, in case you're not sure. So it's a box with a handle on the side. And what you have to do is you wind the handle up really slowly and it plays a tune. And then when it gets to a certain point, the character inside jumps out the top of the box. So Roald Dahl used this to describe how Grandma jumped up from her chair. There is also another one, which is kind of a simile. And that's this one, using the word as. It was exactly as though someone had pushed an electric wire through the underneath of her chair and switched on the current. So it's comparing what's happening to Grandma to someone putting an electric wire in her chair. Okay, let's see what happens next. The next chapter is called The Brown Hen. George stood in the farmyard looking up at the roof. The old farmhouse had a fine roof of pale red tiles and tall chimneys. There was no sign of Grandma. There was only a song thrush sitting on one of the chimney pots singing a song. The old Wurzels got stuck in the attic, George thought. Thank goodness for that. Suddenly, a tile came clattering down from the roof and fell into the yard. The song thrush took off fast and flew away. Then another tile came down. Then half a dozen more. And then, very slowly, like some weird monster rising up from the deep, Grandma's head came through the roof. Then her scrawny neck and the tops of her shoulders. How am I doing, boy? She shouted. How's that for a bash up? Don't you think you'd better stop now, Grandma? George called out. I have stopped, she answered. I feel terrific. Didn't I tell you I had magic powers? Didn't I warn you I had wizardry in the tips of my fingers? But you wouldn't listen to me, would you? You You didn't do it, Grandma, George shouted back to her. I did it. I made you a new medicine. A new medicine? You? What rubbish! She yelled. I did, George shouted. You're lying as usual, Grandma yelled. You're always lying. I'm not lying, Grandma. I swear I'm not. The wrinkled old face high up on the roof stared down suspiciously at George. Are you telling me you actually made a new medicine all by yourself? She shouted. Yes, Grandma, all by myself. I don't believe you, she answered. But I'm very comfortable up here. Fetch me a cup of tea. A brown hen was pecking about in the yard close to where George was standing. The hen gave him an idea. Quickly, he uncorked the medicine bottle and poured some of the brown stuff into the spoon. Watch this, Grandma, he shouted. He crouched down, holding out the spoon to the hen. Chicken, he said. Chicken. Come here, have some of this. Chickens are stupid birds and very greedy. They think everything is food. This one thought the spoon was full of corn. It hopped over. It put its head on one side and looked at the spoon. Come on, chicken, George said. Good chicken. Chick. The brown hen stretched out its neck towards the spoon and went, peck. It got a beakful of the medicine. The effect was electric. Owie! Shrieked the hen, and it shot straight up into the air like a rocket. It went as high as the house. Then down it came again into the yard, splosh. And there it sat with its feathers all sticking straight out from its body. There was a look of amazement on its silly face. George stood watching it. Grandma up on the roof was watching it too. The hen got to its feet. It was rather shaky. It was making funny gurgling noises in its throat. Its beak was opening and shutting. It seemed like a pretty sick hen. You've done it in, you stupid boy, Grandma shouted. That hen's going to die. Your father will be after you now. He'll give you socks and serve you right. All of a sudden, black smoke started pouring out of the hen's beak. It's on fire, Grandma yelled. The hen's on fire. George ran to the water trough to get a bucket of water. That hen'll be roasted and ready for eating any moment, Grandma shouted. George sloshed the bucket of water over the hen. There was a sizzling sound and the smoke went away. Old hen's laid its last egg, Grandma shouted. Hens don't do any laying after they've been on fire. Now that the fire was out, the hen seemed better. It stood up properly. It flapped its wings. Then it crouched down low to the ground as though getting ready to jump. It did jump. It jumped high in the air and turned a complete somersault, then landed back on its feet. It's a circus hen, Grandma shouted from the rooftop. It's a flipping acrobat. Now the hen began to grow. George had been waiting for this to happen. It's growing, he yelled. It's growing, Grandma. Look, it's growing. Bigger and bigger, taller and taller it grew. Soon the hen was 4 or 5 times its normal size. Can you see it, Grandma? George shouted. I can see it, boy, the old girl shouted back. I'm watching it. George was hopping about from one foot to the other with excitement, pointing at the enormous hen and shouting, It's had the magic medicine, Grandma, and it's growing just like you did. But there was a difference between the way the hen was growing and the way Grandma grew. When Grandma grew taller and taller, she got thinner and thinner. The hen didn't. It stayed nice and plump all along. Soon it was taller than George, but it didn't stop there. It went right on growing until it was about as big as a horse. Then it stopped. Doesn't it look marvellous, Grandma? George shouted. It's not as tall as me, Grandma sang out. Compared with me, that hen is titchy small. I am the tallest of them all. Did you spot some similes in that chapter? For example, the hen growing about as big as a horse. We'll have to wait until tomorrow to find out what happens next. But here are the tasks we'd like you to do today. Firstly, you can go onto Google Classroom and have a look at this Sassy Similes sheet. They've given you 2 examples of similes from the chapter. For example, up she went like a jack-in-the-box, and she shot out of the roof like a rocket. What we'd like you to do is finish these similes. So we have Grandma's stomach exploded like, your job is to finish that off. And Grandma was as shocked as. You can either print the sheet and write on it, or you can just write your similes on paper. Then, at the bottom, it's time to think of some of your own similes for Grandma. So remember to use like or as, and you could describe her appearance, particularly when she's growing. You could describe her personality, or you could describe what was happening to her. But remember, you need to be comparing it to something else, using a simile. The second task we'd like you to do involves some drawing. So we'd like you to draw a picture of Grandma and then draw other things on the page and label it with similes to show just how tall she is. So the examples I've got here are tall like a tower or as high as a house. See what else you can think of to describe Grandma's height using similes. You could also include the giant hen. I hope you enjoy thinking of lots of fun similes and drawing your picture of Grandma. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.